Hi, my name is Josh McQueen, and this is my interview with John McQueen for my genealogical research class. Today we are at the Crystal Bay Hotel in St. Petersburg, Florida, and it is July 4th, 2026. John, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure.
Just to kind of kick things off, I know you had some other questions to look at ahead of time, but what is your full name, when, and where you were born?
Sure. So my full name is John Thomas McQueen. I was born right here in beautiful St. Petersburg, Florida. Not here in the Crystal Bay Hotel, but at St. Anthony's Hospital. And I was born on July 27th, 1964. And so I'm a multi-generational St. Pete native.
Amazing. Now, I know you said you're from St. Pete, but can you kind of tell us a little bit more detail about where you grew up? What was your childhood home like, or your neighborhood like?
Sure. So I grew up on what's known as the south side of St. Pete,
Yeah.
Off of Cypress Way South and Sunrise Drive. We had a really interesting home growing up because my mom and dad, when they bought it, added on multiple times, and so it was a huge house. In fact, our upstairs hallway, I remember my brother and I used to race our Evel Knievel motorcycles down it. It was 99 feet long from one end of the room to the other in the hall, and so all my friends used to want to always come to our house because it was kind of a cool house, and so it was a great neighborhood to grow up in. We had a lot of other old-time St. Pete families that lived there, like the famous Rutland Bussey Mansion was in our neighborhood, things like that. So it was a great place to grow up.
No, it sounds great. Sounds like a good house. I know next question's kind of more focused on your parents. Do you mind sharing who your parents were? You can go one by one, but also share what do you remember most about them?
Sure. So my parents were William Finlayson McQueen, and my mother was Clara Battle McQueen, and so they met here in St. Pete. My mom obviously had been, born and raised here too, and my dad grew up in St. Pete. He was born in North Florida in a little town called Old Town, Florida. He was born a month after his father had passed away, and so his father had asked that all of his 8 children be sent to St. Pete to grow up in the Masonic home, which back then was a home for the orphaned and the aged, and so they basically grew up in a orphanage. But after World War II, we were late life babies. So after World War II, my dad went into the funeral business. My mom had already been working, and she was a florist. And so lo and behold, the funeral director meets the florist, and it seemed like a match made in heaven. And so again, they ended up getting married. And then my mom actually, because since she had her own business, my mom ended up loaning my dad the money to be able to start his own funeral home.
Wow.
And so the family grew from there. What I remember most about them, my dad had served as a tank commander in World War II under General Patton, and so he pretty much ran his life and his business and his family much like Patton ran his war. There was one way, and that was his way. And I also remember that he had what I always said was the fastest belt in the West. If I got in trouble, boy, he could get that belt off faster than anything I'd ever seen. My mom, on the other hand, again, she was extremely creative. She was very artistic, not just as a florist, but she, in a lot of the buildings here in St. Pete, she had done permanent type structures for them, cascading waterfalls for multi-stories and things. But her dream had always been to someday work for Disney. And so again, I remember she did my sister's room in our house from a book that my sister loved. She hand painted all the characters and things on the wall. So when it came to doing things, she was the one you went to if you wanted to be very creative.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. It sounds like they both had their skills. What's that? What did a normal family dinner look like for you guys?
Well, for me, it was usually my father telling me to eat what was on my plate, and they would always say how, children in Ethiopia that don't have food, you need to clean your plate, you know. But my father didn't get off work until 6 o'clock, so he usually got home about 6:30. And again, at that point, it was like, you know, when Dad walked in the door, dinner went on the table, we all sat down and ate together as a family.
Yeah. No, that's great. So, I know you said that your dad grew up in an orphanage. His father passed away right before he was born, but is there anything you remember about either side, grandparents, or that you've been told about grandparents that you kind of remember?
Sure. Well, as far as the grandparents are concerned, I only knew one of my 4 grandparents.
Okay.
So I'll back up a minute before I tell you about my dad's side. My mom's side, her father died in his early 40s. She was 16 when he died, so she, although she finished high school, she went out to work to help support the family, you know. They had, I think, 8 children in the family. She was the oldest daughter. She was the 4th child, and so she went and got a job to help take care of the family. And then her mother, my mom always wanted me to be born on her mother's birthday, which was July 28th. And but I came early on July 27th. But her mom had passed away back in I think it was back in the early 50s, 1951 or 52, somewhere in that range. On my dad's side of the family, my paternal grandfather, so again, he died a month before my dad was born. He had worked for the railroad, and again, up in Old Town, Florida, which actually the McQueen family was one of the 2 original families that settled to Old Town, Florida. The other family was actually also, you know, related to us, but sometimes there were little feuds in those small towns.
Yeah.
So my dad's dad, his father-in-law had a hunting dog, as the story goes, and this other gentleman, for some reason, got upset and took and threw his father-in-law's dog in a fire.
What?
And so my dad went down and with his gun, told him to get on his knees and start praying, and he better pray loud, because as soon as he said amen, my grandfather was going to blow his head off. And so they went and got his father-in-law, brought him down, and they calmed everything down and all that. But not too long after that, my grandfather was riding his horse on the way home down the street, and that gentleman shot my grandfather in the back from the 2nd-story window of a house, and my grandfather died, I think 3 or 4 days later, from blood poisoning from the bullet back then. And so again, that's how then all the kids got sent down to the Masonic home. So the only one I knew was my paternal grandmother, and she had sort of moved around with each of the sons. Yeah. And they took turns letting her live with her for a while. And so she was sort of a handful. I didn't notice it as much, you know, because I was a young kid, but she died when I was about 7. And she was a nice lady. She always carried this little canister around in her apron, which I never quite knew what it was. And then later on in life, I realized that was her snuff. So she would dip snuff, or tobacco nowadays, they would probably call it. But, and you know, imagine my mom was a kind of a strong woman. She was somewhat of a strong woman. So when my mom was redecorating and remodeling the house, she actually, I always wondered why they did this, and I found out later on. She actually had the kitchen made where they were double sinks, one opposite the other. So that way she could put a few dishes over there and let my grandmother, who would take forever to wash the dishes, wash a few dishes, and my mom could be on the other side and actually get it all done in a hurry and finishing things up. But like I said, she died when I was around 7.
Yeah. Well, outside of grandparents, parents, I mean, they absolutely can be the answer, but were there any relatives that you feel had major influence on the family as a whole?
Sure. Well, I don't know about on the family as a whole, but on me as a whole,
Yeah.
I guess. So my mom and dad separated when I was in the second grade.
Okay.
They did not divorce until I was a senior in high school.
Wow.
And I did, for a few years, I never even saw my dad, but then later on I did work with him and saw him. But his brother, his older brother, Fletcher, so my uncle Fletcher was a big influence on my life and taught me a lot of life lessons. And he still lived up in Old Town area.
Yeah.
And then his two sons, Ronnie and Tommy, my cousins, I spent a lot of time with the two of them as well as my Uncle Fletcher. And so those three men probably had the greatest influence on me as a kid growing up. I remember my Uncle Fletcher taught me that, you always wanted to do it right the first time, when they taught us how to put in a barbed wire fence, you wanted to get the fence post in right the first time because, it's a lot of work and it's hard and all that, but it's a lot more tiring when you got to come back and do it a second time.
Yeah.
And then he taught me how to defend myself, things like that, if I needed to. So
That's great. So kind of switching gears here to more of a focus on family origins and migration, how we got to the United States, how you got to St. Pete. Do you know where, I guess, the sides of our family originally came from?
Sure. So again, I used to always say that we were sort of like the mutts of America,
Yeah.
So we were a blend of a lot of things, but I'll focus on a few of the main ones. How's that? So the McQueen side of the family actually came from Scotland. So we came from a town called Corryborough, Scotland. In fact, actually, our family was the chieftain of the McQueen clan that was in Corryborough, and so again, they ended up migrating to the United States. The first one that we have record of living in the United States is the one they call, which you can search on the internet, is Daniel the Immigrant. And he came here in the early 1700s, I think it was around 1716. And then obviously each generation from there. Some of the ones that are in our family though, that and some of it could be folklore and some of it could be factual.
Yeah,
and
it's kind of what you've heard.
I've heard all the stories. My mother was sort of the family historian, but I'm still working on confirming some of them. But Don Juan McQueen, who actually lived in Florida under Spain, he was considered to be one of our relatives. Also, actually, Chief Osceola of the Seminole Indians, his uncle was McQueen, Peter McQueen, and Osceola's real name is Billy Powell, and so Peter McQueen was his uncle, and he's in our bloodline.
Okay.
And so that would be sort of some of the ones from the McQueen side. On my mother's side, her mother, so my maternal grandmother, was a Sherbino, and actually tracing back multiple generations, obviously, the first Sherbino that came from France, came to Canada. He was actually considered to be one of the first French-Canadian families to live in Canada. And so he had 8 children. One of his sons was Joseph Sherbino, and that's the line that came down to be my mother.
Okay.
And one of his other sons was Michael Sherbino, and Michael Sherbino, if you traced his down about 4 generations, there was a gentleman called Toussaint Sherbino, and Toussaint is the one that married Sacagawea, and
Really?
they led Lewis and Clark on their expedition across the United States. So we're related, as my mom would always say, we were related to Toussaint Sherbino and Sacagawea. Obviously, it's not direct bloodline, but I think he's would be like a seventh uncle twice removed or some weird thing like that. On my paternal grandmother's side, that was the Finlaysons, where my father got his middle name. And so W.D. Finlayson, which would have been her father, he served in the Florida Senate. He actually, he and one of the other family members, the Cottrells, that settled the Old Town area. They're the ones that took Lafayette County and got it split into Dixie County and Lafayette County and all that. But, and then the last one on my mom's side, again, her dad was a Battle. That's where it was Clara Battle McQueen. But I think it was my grandmother's father's side. Anyways, there's a Weisenborn in the family. He was German, and so I think it was during World War I, but he was like a mayor in Germany, and he and his family fled Germany to come to the U.S. And as the story goes, they had two sons, and as they were taking the little steamship across to the U.S., a lady or a young child, I forget who, but fell overboard, and the two sons jumped in to save him, and unfortunately forgot back in those days they wore money belts underneath their clothing.
Yeah.
And they had their money belts on and actually drowned because of that, and so the sons never made it to the U.S., but
wow.
The father and mother did, and so again, that's kind of how that part went.
Definitely. Well, it definitely sounds like you have a wide background. I feel obligated to ask, since I feel like someone else might ask. Last name McQueen. Any relation to Steve McQueen?
Well, we're still proving it. My mother always said that we were, and so far with the help of my friend ChatGPT, we're working it back, that and ancestry. But if we are technically related, which I think that we are, because the same time frame that Daniel the immigrant came over, there were several other McQueens that came too. In all honesty, they were prisoners.
Yeah.
And they had been given the choice of either being, I think it was pronounced Jacobite or something like that, but they were part of some revolt or whatever, and they were captured, and they were given the choice of being hung and quartered or being sent off to America. So they chose America, but a group of them came together, so we haven't quite made that connection, but it would have been back in Scotland's side. Okay. But we're working on it.
Yeah.
And as far as Lightning McQueen, in case people ask you,
that's a weird one too.
I'm not sure if we're related to Lightning. I haven't found that connection.
I think you gotta be. You know, you got the same smile.
There you go.
Did anyone, or I was going to ask, did anyone in the family move from another country, but we answered that. Were there any places that were especially important to the family, or whether it's your immediate family or extended family? Was there anywhere that was like, this is important to us?
Well, I would say probably for my mom, St. Pete was important because she was born and raised here and grew up here. But for myself and at least a lot of the family on the McQueen side, Old Town was the important spot, even though they were sent off to live in St. Pete in the Masonic home. A lot of them tended to migrate back to Old Town, and the interesting thing, my father had to grow up in the Masonic home. He hated the Masonic home, but I guess like any kids, when you grow up somewhere, you have a connection to it, and so that was the only home he knew. So every time the Masonic home would have their family reunion things, and he would always go back to that, as well as his brothers and sisters and stuff. And so those would probably be the places, I guess.
No, definitely. Now, a little bit of a focus on kind of your family's religion, culture. Do you mind sharing what religious background your family had?
Sure. So my mom's side of the family, obviously being French Canadian and even the battle side, they were all Catholic.
Okay.
When my family founded Old Town, there was a Methodist church, I think it was, and maybe it was Lutheran. I don't remember the other one, but most of that family at the time was Methodist. My dad ended up being Baptist because when they moved here to the Masonic home, it was the Baptist minister that would always come into the Masonic home and do a service there at the Masonic home. So he just went with the Baptist. But, and so the funny thing is, when my mom and dad got married, my dad was not going to convert to Catholicism. My mom wasn't going to leave Catholicism. So they ended up getting married at her brother's house, my Uncle Tom. And then later on, when they separated, my mom used to always say, well, you know, I don't believe in divorce, so I'm not gonna divorce your dad. And you know, my dad, in all honesty, I think was too afraid to ask my mom for a divorce until I got to be a senior in high school. So Baptist and Catholic primarily.
Do you think that caused any of the tension there?
Could have, you know, maybe. So you know, when I was growing up, you know, I always had a relationship with God, but we never really went to church a lot. And we were sort of more the Christmas church goer and Easter Sunday church goer because, again, my mom didn't want to take us to the Catholic church and upset my father. My father didn't want to take us to the Baptist church and upset my mother. So Sundays were more about the old TV shows and things, you know, Jerry Lewis and the Three Stooges and those types of things.
So I know you said you never really went to church except maybe the holidays. Which one would you go to when you did go? Did you?
Well, Christmas, a lot of times, to be honest, we never went. Well, I shouldn't say we never went. I went a couple of times to the Catholic church, but and my mom had supposedly baptized us Catholic when we were babies while we were still in the hospital, but usually we went to somebody else's church. Okay. So like the Rutland family I mentioned before, they went to First United Methodist Church, and so a lot of times for Christmas Eve Mass, we would go to the Methodist church with them. And then actually when I was a kid, my mom and dad were still together. The Masonic home always did a big Easter Sunday sunrise service, and so we would go there, and they had a big band shell there, and usually, again, I think it was still the Baptist minister who was the one that came in and did that service. So those were primarily.
Definitely. So I know outside of, you know, church, because I know that was a whole thing, were there any cultural traditions, foods, holidays, languages, customs kind of passed down from the family?
Well, probably the way that I spoiled you and your sister on Christmas is probably the holiday tradition that was passed down. My dad grew up with really nothing from the Masonic home. My mom, their family struggled because her dad died early. So I can remember my mom telling us as kids that, you know, she would go out and buy the Christmas presents and stuff, you know, and back then I guess $1 went further, but, you know, she would like fill this one room she had that she kept secret from us, fill it with toys. And then my dad, you know, he would complain about giving her the money to go Christmas shopping, but then a few days before Christmas, she'd say, well, here's what I've got. And she'd open the door and he'd see this room full of toys, and he'd be like, is that all you got? And he'd give her more money and send her out to buy more toys, which of course would then upset her because she was trying to plan ahead and beat the rush, and now she had to go back out into Christmas rush. And that's kind of what I do with your mother and you all on Christmas, but so I guess that would be a tradition. But that's probably about it. You know?
Definitely, and I think that's a good tradition. But on to a little bit about family stories, major events. Is there a family story that you think should not be forgotten? I know that's a tough question.
Yeah, well, so right now I'm trying to write a legacy book on all of our family stories and our family background and things, so we can pass it on to, well, not only you and your sister, but on to our grandchildren and others, because I have that fear as I get older in life that my mom used to tell all the old family stories, and as a kid you listened to them. The first couple times they were kind of interesting, and by the 50th time you weren't listening anymore. And yet now I wished I hadn't remembered them or listened to them more. So trying to write all that down and get those stories.
Definitely.
One would be obviously how my grandfather got killed. Is a big one. The migration of the Charbonneau family to Canada, and then the connection with Toussaint Charbonneau and Sacagawea. That's an important part of our family history. I think also a couple of other stories. One that I think is important is, so your grandfather, my dad, like I said, he wasn't real fond of the Masonic home per se, but so he excelled in sports and music, and so he got a scholarship to Florida Military Academy, and it's now Stetson Law School here.
Wow.
And when he graduated from Florida Military Academy, he was a lieutenant, and he actually then got a job at Florida Power, because back then it was more about who you knew in life, but they needed a good shortstop to play on their baseball team, and he was a great athlete, so they gave him a job because you couldn't play on their team unless you worked for them, so they gave him a job so he could play on the baseball team. He also was a boxer, and so not only did he excel in boxing while he was in school, but he went on to be ranked, I think he was a middleweight Golden Gloves boxing champion in Florida. But I think the important part though was when World War II broke out, he enlisted in the military, and he ended up in tanks, and I always thought it was interesting, and so I asked him one time, how did you end up in tanks? Actually, it was for a school paper. And he shared that what happened was he went down to enlist, and he had been trained for the infantry, and I still say the guy that was the recruiting officer must have been a salesman, because when he said, well, I'm going to go in the infantry, the guy said, well, have you ever thought about tanks? And my dad said, I've never even seen a tank. And so this went back and forth 2 or 3 times, and finally this guy said, well, Lieutenant, the infantry or tanks is just like the infantry. The only difference is you ride instead of walk. And so my dad was like, oh, well, that sounds good. So he got shipped off to tank headquarters, wherever they learned how to do tanks. Anyways, he was assigned as a tank commander, and he was actually a recon officer. And so the battalion that he was in, I think it was the 8th Battalion, was one of the ones that stormed across Europe and took down Germany and all that stuff. And so he ended up having, his tank would go out ahead of everybody else, find the Germans, and then their primary job was to turn around and haul ass, as he would say, and hope that they didn't get caught. So 13 tanks got blown out from under him.
Wow.
In the last one, as the tank commander, he had to jump out of they had to jump out the top. The other guys tried to get out the bottom, and he took shrapnel in his hip. And so then he obviously was in the middle of German territory, so he dug himself into sort of like a drainage ditch and hid there until the Germans left. And then he made his way down to a little German village, and this German lady put him in her cellar, and he said he sat at the bottom of the cellar steps with because he carried a handgun, with his gun pointed up the stairs, and it took about 3 days, but Patton sent in reinforcements to get him out, and he was like, when he heard somebody coming, he was like, well, if they're not wearing the right color uniform, before they take me out, I'm going to take a few of them out. And so, but it was his own guys coming to get him. And so again, like I said, my dad always ran his business and his life like Patton ran his own. There was one way, and it was his way.
he definitely learned a lot from the military, I'm sure.
That he did.
For yourself, what's your favorite family memory?
Favorite family memory?
And it doesn't have to be about me.
Oh, well, that makes it even harder then. Trying to think here, favorite family memory.
And we can come back to that if you want.
Well, it's kind of a weird couple of family memories.
Yeah.
One was when I was young, I wanted to be able to ride my bicycle, and so, you always got the hand-me-downs. It was really my brother's bicycle, and I wasn't quite big enough. You know how a guy's bike has the bar that comes across?
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't quite big enough to ride that with the bar on there and touch the ground to stop. So my dad, who was not much of a mechanic, I guess he could fix a tank, but he couldn't fix anything else. He figured out how to take that bar off. And so the only problem is it left two spikes sticking out underneath the handlebars like this where it hooks on. And so then one day my brother said, hey, I'll teach you how to tow somebody. And so my brother was on the back, and we were riding down the road, and I was doing pretty good. And then as we went to turn into our driveway, there was an island out in front of our house, like a little triangle thing for yielding. And he said, oh, just cut across here. And so as I cut across, the back tire slid out from under me. Those two spikes went in my throat. And so needless to say, my mom never let my dad work on anything again. And then the other story was I wanted to have a tree fort when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And so my mom said, well, you have to ask your dad. When I said for my birthday, I go, for my birthday, can I have a tree fort? And so my mom said, well, ask your dad. So I walked around to the other side of the king-size bed in their room, and I said, hey, Dad, can I have a tree house for my birthday? And so he said, sure, you can have a tree house. And so a few days later, Pinellas Lumber, which was a big lumber company here in town, they showed up with like 3 or 4 trucks packed full of all this lumber and stuff. And I go back to, my mom always wanted to work for Disney, right? So she built the closest thing you could to the Swiss Family Robinson tree house, and it was like 3 or 4 stories tall and all this stuff. So later on in life, my brother and I were playing cops and robbers, and he was first the robber and I was the cop, and he's 3 years older than me, so he had that spatial stuff in his head that I didn't at the time.
Yeah.
So he got on the roof, and every time I would look up, he'd pour Coke on me. And so I finally got fed up with that and said, well, I want to be the bad guy. So I climbed up on the roof, and he was underneath. And so what I would do is lean over the roof and wait until I saw him stick his head out. Then I'd pour my root beer. It was a frosty root beer, by the way. I'd pour the root beer, and he could duck back because he do that spatial distance stuff. And so then all of a sudden he heard clink, clink, clink of this frosty root beer can come down and hit the ground. And then he heard, as John fell off the roof, came through the tree, hit a post on the way down, dislocated my shoulder, and I think I even broke my collarbone on that one. And, so then my mom took me to the doctor because back in that day, we didn't have ambulances and stuff, so mom threw me in the car and took me to the doctors, and they said, oh, here's what's wrong with him, and they put me in a sling. And on the way home, we pulled up to the traffic light not too far from our house, and the car that pulled up next to me on the right-hand side was none other than my dad. And he looked over and saw my arm in a sling and said, roll down your window. I rolled down my window, and he's like, what the hell happened to you? And I'm like, I fell off the tree fort roof. He was like, your mother never should have let you have that tree house. So those are probably a couple of them that stick with me.
That is a wonderful family memory. So I know your family was unique. You were explaining the situation with your dad on a funeral home, your mom on a flower shop, your mom's from St. Pete. What do you feel your family reputation was in the community?
Well, I think we had a very good family reputation. I mean, our family business, even when my dad had it, was the largest family-owned funeral home in St. Pete, and then we ended up as next generations, and then with your mom joining me when I bought out my brother and sister, we grew it to being the largest family-owned funeral home in Florida. So I think we had a very good reputation there. My mom, she had quit the flower business shortly before I was born because she was in a car accident, broke her neck, and so she ended up closing her flower shop. But every organization under the sun when I was a kid growing up always asked her, did you do the flowers for this event, that event, and everything else? And so she would always volunteer for that. I think we also had a good reputation because my mother, even when after my mom and dad separated, my mother was always like, you know, you all will behave in public, and you will, you know, do all this, you know, and be the best you can be, because your dad owns a business in town, and people, you know, look to us, and so we got to make sure that you know, we're behaving and doing all of that. So I'd say we got a decent reputation.
Definitely. Were there any, it could be for your immediate family, but and we kind of covered it a little, I feel, but were there any other major hardships, tragedies, illnesses, wars, moves, financial struggles that you feel shaped the family or greatly affected it?
Well, I think obviously as we look at family as a whole, going back, you know, so again, probably on my dad's side, the death of his father obviously led them all to the Masonic Home of Florida, and then into the war and those types of things. They lived through, both sides of the family lived through the Great Depression, you know, all of that. So my father grew up with nothing and built a successful business, and so I know, like, for him, we would get our casket bill would come in once a month, you know, and obviously as soon as it showed up, he would write a check that day and send it out in the mail, and I was always like, Dad, why do you do that? You know, they give you so many days to pay, why do you do that? And he's like, because I want him to know I can pay my bills, you know, and I think that was the depression, the orphanage, all of that. Also, when I look at some of the family dynamics of, you know, the way maybe he didn't really understand how to be a dad sometimes, was because he never had a father type example from that. On my mom's side, her dad ran a big clothing store, and her grandfather had been a contractor here in town that built a lot of the old buildings in St. Pete. And so when her dad died, one of her first jobs, she was the first Lifesavers girl in St. Pete. So her job, she dressed sort of and carried a tray sort of that looked like what would be the old cigarette girls back in the day. But it was actually for Lifesavers candy, and it was her job to walk up and down Central Avenue and give out free samples of the new candy with a hole in the center. And then from there, she went to work for Mr. Mitchell, and they had Mitchell's Florist, and that's where she really learned the flower business. But Mr. Mitchell, he was quite the businessman, and so he taught her a lot about business. And so both my parents, you know, they tried to be good, you know, spend money on their kids some and stuff, but they also both have very strong work ethics that they pass along to each of their children. And,
Definitely.
Maybe I slipped on that with mine, but no, I'm just kidding. But that's how we.
Were there any people, I guess, and you don't have to answer this if they're still alive, but were there any relatives people always talked about, either positively or negatively? I guess, what's the family gossip?
Well, I'm trying to think. I don't, you know, as far as ones we talked about positively, you know, like my brother and I, you know, we would always talk about our cousins Ronnie and Tommy because, you know, they were like the cool ones. You know, my cousin Tommy was the bull rider when he was, you know, in his early 20s and stuff, and he'd win a bunch of those championship rodeo belts and stuff. But Ronnie and Tommy were also water skiers, and so they would put on these water ski shows. They'd steal a lot of this stuff from Cypress Gardens back in the day, and then they'd go recreate it. So, you know, as a kid growing up, we were like, wow, that's cool, man. They fly kites, they do all that stuff. Ones that we never really talked about, I'm trying to think if there really were any. I mean, you know, I don't think we really had very many that we didn't talk about. I know I had one cousin who, she got married, and she married a black gentleman, and this was in the early 70s. And so her family sort of, my mom's sister, her family initially sort of disowned her. And I will say my mom was the one that was like, hey, come stay with us for a while. We took them to Disney World, we did all them, you know, again, we, with my mom's influence, we grew up. She had a lot of guys that would help her on projects and things, and so we never really looked at color as black and white. We looked at more at the person, and if they were a good person, then that's what mattered. If they were a jerk, then that's what mattered. But so I guess I would say overall, as our family, you know, I don't think there were any we never really spoke about, but I do know there's been some skeletons in the closet along the way, I guess.
Well, I guess my last question, kind of focusing on the family major events. How would you say the family is different now compared to when you were young?
How the family is different now. Okay, I guess this, you know, probably the biggest difference is, and maybe this is because, you know, we work together all the time, but so even when my dad was alive, you know, my dad ran the funeral home, I worked at the funeral home, I was the son that was going to go into the family business, my brother worked at the funeral home, my sister worked at the funeral home, and then when my dad died unexpectedly, the three of us inherited the funeral home. So we worked together every day, saw each other every day, everything else. So when it did get around to a family holiday or something like that, we usually didn't spend it together. People always thought that was weird. Why don't you all spend time together as a family? Because I got to see them every day of my life, you know? And so we went from having this really big network of family, you know, cousins and uncles and all that on both sides, and, you know, we would go and visit and see and do things, and now with your generation, we don't really do that. So you have a bunch of cousins and relatives and others out there, but rarely do we see very many of them, you know, so I would say that sort of familyness has changed.
No, definitely feels like it's strong stuff. So kind of about, I know you said your mom acted as the family historian in some. Do you have old family photos, letters, certificates, obituaries, military records, or family Bibles still in existence?
Sure. I do, to all of the above, and obviously being in the funeral business, I've got more obituaries than you can imagine, but you know, at our home, I have our family Bible that's been passed down for 3 or 4 generations that will ultimately probably be passed to you to continue keeping it in the McQueen family. That's, you know, this thick and this big, you know, all that. And then we have a what would have been my great-grandfather when he served in the Civil War. I still have his Civil War rifle that's locked in my gun case, and then we have a bunch of pictures. I have a picture of my mom as the you know, the lifesavers girl. I have pictures of my dad leaning on a shovel outside the funeral home when they planted the oak trees that are so famous around our funeral home, and things like that. So I have a lot of pictures I'm happy to share if you need them.
Definitely. Are there any photos, this is just, if you don't know, that's fine. Are there any photos where there's anyone who's unidentified? You're like, I don't know who these people are on this photo.
So one of them in particular, there's a picture I know one person in the picture, and that's my dad, but it was from the Masonic home, and shortly after he got sent there, and I guess they would every now and then take the kids on a little outing, and it looked like they took them to somewhere down near the old St. Pete Pier, and there's an old-timey car in the picture, and there's some kids, and I think an adult or something, but I know which one's my dad, but I'm going to tell you who the other ones were, because I don't think they were relatives. And then there's some other family photos like that where I'm like, okay, well, I think that's my grandmother, but I have no idea who that other old lady is, type thing. So.
Are there other members of the family that you think would be beneficial to ask for stories, records, that sort of thing?
Sure. I mean, from our side of the family, I would say probably the next best person to ask, the two people to ask that seem to be the family historians in a way. My sister Maggie, your Aunt Maggie, and she's got a lot of the old pictures and things too. And then if you want to know more about, the North Florida family and like Peter McQueen and all those types of things, I would ask probably Ronnie. He seems to know a lot of those and more of the family history of settling Old Town and doing all of that.
Definitely. Now, when you think about...
Just don't tell them about the family Bible. Okay?
No. I'll keep it secret. Well, now, when you think about family history, do you feel there's one person that kind of best represents the family?
Gosh, that's tough because, my last name is McQueen, so, I want to lean towards McQueen, but in all honesty, I think if I had to pick one person that best represents our family, I would say is my mom. She, again, besides being artistic and all that, she was way ahead of her time, when she opened her flower shop. There weren't a lot of women that even owned their own businesses back then. And so she was always hardworking. She was, I guess I would use the word resilient, given the things that happened in her life as a child, as well as with her marriage. And she always put her kids first, made sure we were taken care of. And if there was something that we needed, it didn't matter whether she could afford to do it or not, she'd find a way to get it done. And so I would say she's probably our best representation of our family.
Definitely.
As well as knowing everything about her side of the family and everything about my dad's side of the family. So.
Definitely. No, it sounds like it. And then I guess final question, is there anything that you want the younger generations to remember about the family, or anything that you feel might disappear if no one writes it down, like something that anything else that you want to add?
I think the biggest thing to pass on to the next generations is the fact that, everything is possible for us. We can reach those dreams we have or those things we want, but it takes hard work and it takes dedication, and you have to keep working at it. I mean, if my two parents could go from struggling to get by or growing up in an orphanage to being well off and well respected, and pretty much living that American dream, we all can do that. If you're willing to put in the effort to make it happen.
Yes, sir. Well, that's pretty much all the questions I have for you today. I appreciate you taking the time for everything. So, this has been the interview with John McQueen for my genealogical research project, and that's it.